The courtroom fell silent as my parents' lawyer finished reading their lawsuit demanding every penny of my grandfather's $5 million inheritance. My mother sat there in her designer dress, the same woman who'd thrown me out at 16 for being too much trouble. My father wouldn't even look at me, just like the day he chose his new wife over his own son. They thought this would be easy money that I'd roll over like I always had. But when Judge Harrison looked up from the papers and recognized me, everything changed in ways none of us saw coming. I'm Ted, and my story starts with the kind of betrayal that cuts so deep it changes your DNA. Picture this. You're 16 years old, your parents are divorced, and instead of fighting over who gets custody, they're fighting over who has to take you. Spoiler alert, nobody won that fight because nobody wanted to. My father, Robert, had already moved on with his life. His new wife, Crystal, was 28, blonde, and had the kind of smile that looked sweet until you realized it never reached her eyes. She saw me as competition for whatever inheritance she thought was coming her way. Every family dinner became a strategic game where she'd plant little seeds about how I was draining Robert's resources and how they needed to focus on their future together. My mother, Linda, took the divorce harder than anyone expected. She started drinking wine at lunch, then vodka at breakfast, then pretty much anything she could find by dinner. In her twisted logic, I became the symbol of everything wrong with her life. If I hadn't been born, she reasoned, Robert never would have felt trapped. If I didn't exist, she could have been free to pursue her dreams of becoming an artist in Paris. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March. I remember because it was the day before my physics test, and I was staying up late studying when I heard them on the phone. Robert and Linda having one of their rare civil conversations about their TED problem. Crystal and I want to do a European tour for our honeymoon, Robert said through the speaker. 6 months, maybe 8. It would be good for us to start fresh. That sounds wonderful, Linda replied. Her words slightly slurred. I was thinking about that art retreat in Sedona. Find myself again. What about Ted? Robert asked, and I held my breath. He's 16, almost 17, Linda said with a dismissive laugh. Kids these days are so independent. Besides, it might be good for him to figure things out on his own. Build character. So we're agreed then he can stay with friends or something. Absolutely, I'm tired of my life revolving around someone else's needs. That conversation lasted 12 minutes. 12 minutes to decide that their only child was disposable. The next morning, they sat me down at the kitchen table like they were delivering good news. Crystal stood behind Robert with her hand on his shoulder, playing the supportive wife role to perfection. Son, Robert began. And I knew I was in trouble because he only called me son when he was about to disappoint me. We've made some decisions about our futures. Linda jumped in probably because she'd already started drinking. Your father and Crystal are going to Europe, and I'm going to find myself in Arizona. This is a wonderful opportunity for all of us to grow. I stared at them, waiting for the part where they explained how this involved me. The silence stretched until Crystal cleared her throat. Ted, sweetie, she said with that fake concerned voice, you're practically an adult. This is your chance to prove you can handle independence. Where am I supposed to live? I asked. You'll figure it out, Linda said, waving her hand like she was swatting a fly. Maybe stay with friends, get a job, learn some responsibility. You're kicking me out. We're giving you freedom, Robert corrected. And the fact that he could say that with a straight face still amazes me. They left 2 weeks later. Robert and Crystal flew to London for their extended honeymoon. Linda drove to Arizona in her BMW, singing along to her meditation CDs. I watched from my bedroom window as she loaded her car with crystals and self-help books, leaving behind everything that reminded her of her old life, including me. That first night alone in the house was the longest of my life. I kept thinking they'd come back, that this was some kind of test. But when the utilities got shut off 3 days later, I realized this wasn't temporary. They'd simply abandoned their responsibilities and moved on. I tried staying with friends, But explaining why your parents just disappeared is harder than you'd think. Most families have enough problems without taking in someone else's kid. I bounced around for a few weeks wearing out welcomes and running out of options. That's when I discovered the fine art of urban survival. The high school gym stayed open until 9 p.m. for basketball practice, and if you knew which window didn't latch properly, you could slip back in after the janitor's rounds. The YMCA had day passes for $5, which meant hot showers and a place to do homework. The public library had free internet and stayed open until 8. I got a job bussing tables at Danny's Diner downtown, working split shifts around school. Then I picked up weekend hours stocking shelves at Peterson's Hardware. By my senior year, I was working 3 jobs: the diner, the hardware store, and weekend landscaping for Mrs. Chen, who lived near the school. The hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion or the constant worry about money, it was the paperwork. Try explaining to a school counselor why you don't have a permanent address when you're applying for college. Try getting a bank account when you can't prove where you live. Try filling out financial aid forms when your parents have vanished into thin air. That's when my grandfather William found me. I was restocking paint cans at Peterson's when this tall, silver-haired man walked in, wearing work boots and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. He stood there for a full minute just staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. "You're Robert's boy," he said finally. "Yes, sir, Ted. I'm your grandfather, William, and I've been looking for you for 6 months." He'd hired a private investigator after Robert stopped returning his calls. When he discovered what they'd done, his exact words were, "Those worthless pieces of garbage." William was a man who'd built a construction empire from nothing, and he didn't have patience for people who abandoned their responsibilities. "Where are you living?" he asked. I told him the truth about the gym, the YMCA, the 3 jobs. I expected pity, but what I saw in his eyes was pure rage. Not at me, at his son. "Pack your things," he said. "You're coming home with me." But here's the twist that changed everything. While William was helping me get back on my feet, my parents had done something that would come back to haunt them. In their rush to start their new lives, they'd gone to a lawyer and officially relinquished their parental rights. They didn't want the legal liability of having a minor they weren't supporting. The paperwork was filed in Jefferson County on April 15th, signed and notarized, making me legally free for adoption. They'd literally signed papers saying they never wanted me back. William Harrison wasn't just my grandfather. He was a force of nature who'd built Harrison Construction from a single pickup truck into the largest commercial building company in 3 counties. His hands were scarred from decades of actual labor, his back was bent from years of carrying more than his share, and his mind was sharper than any lawyer who'd ever tried to outsmart him. But more importantly, he was furious. 43 years I've been disappointed in that boy, he told me as we sat in his kitchen that first night. But this is beyond disappointment. This is evil. He'd been trying to reach Robert for months, wanting to discuss some family business. When the calls went unanswered, he'd driven to their house only to find it empty with a "for rent" sign in the yard. That's when he hired an investigator. Cost me $2,000 to find out my own son threw away his child like garbage. He said stirring sugar into coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. But it cost me a lot more to find out what I'm going to do about it. William had a plan that was years in the making. Every Sunday, he'd invite me over for dinner, and afterward we'd sit in his workshop while he taught me about business, about integrity, about what it means to be a man. But what I didn't know was that he was also documenting everything. "Your father calls me twice a year," he explained during one of our talks. "Christmas and my birthday. Never asks about you, just wants to know about my health and my will. Maybe he's just concerned about your well-being." I said, still hoping for some redemption in my father's character. William laughed bitterly. "Son, I've been recording those conversations for 3 years. Would you like to hear what concern sounds like?" He played me a recording from the previous Christmas. Robert's voice came through crystal clear. "Dad, you're getting older. And Crystal and I worry about you being alone in that big house. Have you thought about updating your estate planning? What about Ted? William had asked. Oh, he's fine. Probably better off learning independence. Kids these days are coddled too much anyway. Besides Crystal, and I could really use some financial help with the house renovations. The conversation continued for 20 minutes. Not once did Robert ask about my grades, my health, or my future. But he mentioned money 14 times. William had similar recordings with Linda, who was even more direct about her feelings. During one particularly painful conversation, she'd said, "That kid was the biggest mistake I ever made. If I could go back, I'd have chosen differently." Some people aren't meant to be parents. Why are you recording these? I asked. Because someday they're going to come back, William said with certainty. Not for you, for money. And when they do, I want the world to know exactly who they are. He was building a case like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Every missed birthday, every unanswered phone call, every time he'd tried to bring the family together, only to be told that Robert and Linda were too busy or dealing with their own issues. But the most damaging evidence came from family gatherings that I wasn't invited to. William had started wearing a small recording device to holiday dinners and summer barbecues, capturing conversations where my parents discussed their relief at being free from the burden. At Crystal's birthday party the previous summer, she'd actually toasted to new beginnings and leaving dead weight behind. The recording captured the clinking glasses and knowing laughter from Robert and Linda. William's lawyer, Margaret Stone, was a 60-year-old woman who looked like someone's sweet grandmother until she opened her mouth in a courtroom. She'd been handling William's legal affairs for 20 years, and she'd watched Robert's moral decline with professional interest. I've seen plenty of inheritance battles, she told me during one of our planning sessions. But I've never seen parents who've provided this much evidence against themselves. The will William was crafting wasn't just about money, it was about justice. He'd structured it so that Robert and Linda would have every legal right to challenge it because he wanted them to. He wanted them to stand up in court and explain why they deserved an inheritance from the man whose grandson they'd abandoned. The beauty of this plan, Margaret explained, is that they'll hang themselves with their own words. But William had added a provision that I didn't learn about until much later. He'd established a trust fund that could only be accessed if Robert and Linda could prove they'd made genuine efforts to contact me in the past 5 years. Not just token attempts, but real documented efforts to rebuild the relationship they'd destroyed. William had copies of every bill he'd paid for me the emergency room visit, when I had appendicitis, the car repairs, when my old Honda broke down the college application fees, the textbooks, the graduation suit, every expense that should have been handled by my parents, he'd covered while they were living their authentic lives. Your father borrowed $50,000 from me 2 years ago, William revealed during one of our Sunday dinners. Said it was for your college fund. Want to guess where that money really went? He showed me the receipts. Crystal's jewelry business. A failed venture that lasted 6 months and burned through the money like it was newspaper. Robert had forged my name on financial aid forms, claiming I was receiving family support that didn't exist. Linda had been worse. She'd taken $20,000, claiming it was for my medical expenses after a basketball injury that required physical therapy. The money had actually paid for her cosmetic surgery and 3 months at a spiritual retreat. That was really just an expensive vacation. They've been stealing from you before you even knew you had anything to steal, William said. But they made one critical mistake. They put everything in writing. Every loan, every request, every excuse was documented in emails, text messages, and bank records. William had saved it all, organizing it like evidence for a trial that he knew was coming. Son, he said one evening as we watched the sunset from his back porch, I'm not going to live forever, but I'm going to make sure that when I'm gone, the truth comes with me. The final piece of his plan was the most elegant. He'd changed his will 3 different times, each version offering Robert and Linda opportunities to redeem themselves. If they'd shown any genuine concern for me, any attempt to make amends, the will would have been generous to them. But every time William gave them a chance, they chose money over family. Every time he tested their character, they failed spectacularly. The last time he offered Robert an opportunity to do the right thing was 6 months before he died. William had called and said he was updating his estate planning and wanted to make sure he understood everyone's wishes. "I want to make sure Ted is taken care of," William had said. "Oh, absolutely," Robert had replied. "But you know, Dad, that boy has always been independent. Maybe it would be better to focus on people who really need the help. Crystal and I have been struggling with some investments, and we could really use some family support." That conversation was the last straw. William finalized a will that would give Robert and Linda exactly what they'd asked for nothing. But more than that, it would expose them for what they truly were. The best part, William told me, with a grin that would have made a pirate jealous, is that they're going to pay for their own destruction. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm you can see coming for miles but can't do anything to stop. I walked into the Jefferson County Courthouse, wearing the only suit I owned, a navy blue number that William had bought me for job interviews. My hands were sweating, my stomach was churning, and I kept wondering if this was really happening. That's when I saw him. Robert looked like he'd been living well. His hair was professionally styled, his tan was perfect, and his suit probably cost more than I'd made in 3 months of working construction with William's crew. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted that things would work out in his favor. Linda stood beside him in a cream-colored designer dress that complemented her professionally highlighted hair. She'd obviously spent serious money on whatever procedure had erased the lines around her eyes, and her smile was the kind you see in magazine advertisements for expensive jewelry. But it was Crystal who really caught my attention. She'd positioned herself slightly apart from Robert and Linda, like she was observing the proceedings rather than participating in them. Her red dress was cut to make a statement, and the way she kept checking her phone suggested she had somewhere more important to be. Their lawyer was a man named Bradley Morse, and everything about him screamed expensive. His briefcase was leather that probably came from cows that had been personally massaged. His watch caught the light every time he gestured, which was often. His handshake was firm, his smile was practiced, and his eyes were the kind of cold that made you want to check your pockets afterward. "This should be straightforward," I heard him tell my parents as they settled into their seats. "Inheritance disputes involving abandoned children almost always favor the biological parents, especially when the child has been estranged for years." I wanted to stand up and scream that they'd been the ones who chose the estrangement. But Margaret Stone put a calming hand on my arm. "Let them talk," she whispered. "Every word they say is evidence." Judge Harrison entered the courtroom like he owned it, which I suppose he did. He was a tall man with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent listening to people's worst behavior. His robe was pressed, his manner was professional, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd heard every excuse and wasn't impressed by any of them. "This court will hear the matter of Harrison versus Harrison," he announced, settling into his chair. "Mr. Morse, you may present your client's case." Morse stood with the kind of flourish that probably played well with juries but seemed overdone in this setting. "Your Honor, my clients, Robert and Linda Harrison, come before this court seeking justice in the matter of their father's estate. William Harrison, in his final years, was unduly influenced by their estranged son, who manipulated a sick old man into changing his will." I felt my face getting hot, but Margaret squeezed my arm again. "Mr. Robert Harrison and Ms. Linda Harrison," Morse continued, "have been attempting to reconcile with their son for years, but their efforts have been rebuffed. Despite their best intentions, they've been shut out of both their son's life and their father's estate planning. This will represent not the wishes of a sound mind, but the manipulation of a vulnerable elder by someone who saw an opportunity for financial gain. He was good. I had to give him that. If you didn't know the truth, his story almost sounded reasonable. He painted my parents as loving family members who'd been kept apart by circumstances beyond their control, and me as a calculating opportunist who'd taken advantage of an old man's loneliness. We have evidence, Morse announced dramatically, that Mr. Ted Harrison had been estranged from his parents since his teenage years due to behavioral issues. We have documentation showing multiple attempts by Robert and Linda Harrison to maintain contact with their son, attempts that were consistently rejected. He began presenting what he called evidence-printed emails, phone records, social media posts. But even from across the room, something looked off about them. The formatting was wrong, the timestamps didn't make sense, and the language sounded nothing like how my parents actually communicated. Judge Harrison studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd seen plenty of forged evidence. His expression remained neutral, but I noticed him making notes in margins and marking certain passages with his pen. "Mr. Morse," the judge said after reviewing several pages, "these email communications appear to show your clients attempting to contact Mr. Ted Harrison multiple times over the past 5 years." "Exactly, Your Honor. Despite their persistent efforts to maintain a relationship, they were consistently rebuffed." "And you have proof that these emails were actually sent and received?" "Of course, Your Honor. We have detailed records from their internet service providers confirming every transmission." But that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Judge Harrison was looking at me with a strange expression. Not the neutral professional interest of a judge, but something more personal. Something almost like recognition. "Mr. Ted Harrison," he said slowly, and the courtroom fell silent, "would you please state your full legal name for the record?" "Theodore William Harrison, Your Honor," I replied using the formal name that only appeared on official documents. The judge went completely still. His pen stopped moving, his breathing seemed to pause, and his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thick. "Wait," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're his grandson." The way he said it made it clear he wasn't talking about legal relationships or inheritance disputes. He was talking about something personal, something that connected him to my grandfather in ways that had nothing to do with this courtroom. "Your Honor," Morse said uncertainly, "is there some irregularity with the proceedings?" Judge Harrison didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued staring at me like he was seeing a ghost or maybe solving a puzzle that had been troubling him for years. "Mr. Morse," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "I need to review some additional documents before we continue. This court will recess for 30 minutes. As people began filing out of the courtroom, I caught my parents exchanging worried glances. This clearly wasn't going according to their plan. Crystal looked annoyed, like someone had changed her appointment without telling her. But Morse looked genuinely concerned, like a man who just realized he might have made a serious miscalculation. Judge Harrison gathered his papers and disappeared through the door behind his bench, but not before giving me one more long, searching look. Margaret Stone leaned over and whispered, "I think your grandfather's influence reaches further than any of us realized." What none of us knew yet was that Judge Harrison had been carrying a secret for months, a promise he'd made to a dying friend, and a mission he'd thought he might never have the chance to fulfill. But sitting in that courtroom, looking at the grandson of his oldest friend, he realized that justice sometimes comes in ways you never expect. The recess felt like hours, but when Judge Harrison returned, everything about him had changed. His posture was different, his expression was focused, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade. "This court will reconvene," he announced. "Mr. Morse, before you continue your presentation, I have some questions about your evidence." And that's when our real battle began. When Judge Harrison returned from recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted, like the air pressure before a tornado. He carried a thick folder that hadn't been there before, and his expression had hardened into something that made even Morse sit up straighter. "Mr. Morse," the judge said, settling into his chair, I've had an opportunity to review your client's evidence more thoroughly. Before you continue, I'd like to clarify some timeline issues. Of course, Your Honor. According to your documentation, Mr. Robert Harrison sent 17 emails to his son between January and December of last year, correct? That's correct. And these emails were all attempts to reconcile and rebuild their relationship. Yes, Your Honor. Persistent, heartfelt attempts that were ignored. Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully, then opened his folder. Mr. Stone, would you please approach the bench with your client? Margaret and I walked forward, and she handed the judge a flash drive that looked innocent enough, but contained enough explosive material to level a city block. Your Honor, Margaret said, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. The defense would like to present evidence that directly contradicts Mr. Morse's timeline. Proceed. Margaret connected the flash drive to the courtroom's audio system, and suddenly my grandfather's voice filled the room. It was a recording from last Christmas, crystal clear and unmistakably authentic. Robert Williams' voice said, "I've been trying to reach you about Ted." "Oh, Dad," Robert's voice replied, and I watched my father's face go pale as he recognized his own words. "Listen, Crystal, and I have been talking, and we think it might be better for everyone if Ted just stays out of our lives permanently. That kid was the worst mistake of my life, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." The courtroom fell silent except for the steady hum of the recording system. Crystal's mouth fell open. Linda looked like she'd been slapped. Even Morse seemed stunned by what he was hearing. "But he's your son," Williams' voice continued. "Biologically sure," Robert replied with a laugh that made my skin crawl. "But that doesn't mean I have to keep paying for my teenage mistakes. Crystal and I want to move forward with our lives, and that kid is nothing but dead weight from my past." Margaret stopped the recording and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Your Honor, this recording was made on December 23rd of last year. According to Mr. Morse's evidence, his client sent a heartfelt email to my client on December 24th expressing his desire to reconcile." "That's impossible," Morse said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The defense has 47 similar recordings," Margaret continued, "spanning a period of 3 years. Each one documents the true feelings of the plaintiffs toward my client. Would you like to hear more?" She played a recording of Linda from the previous summer, her words slurred but her meaning clear. "That boy ruined my entire life. If he just disappeared tomorrow, I'd sleep better than I have in 20 years. Then came Crystal's voice from a party recording. "Robert's so much happier since we stopped pretending to care about his mistake. Some people just aren't meant to be parents, you know." With each recording, I watched my parents shrink further into their seats. These weren't taken out of context or manipulated. These were their own words expressing their true feelings when they thought no one was listening. But Margaret was just getting started. "Your Honor, the defense would also like to present financial evidence that contradicts the plaintiff's claims of attempting to support their son." She produced bank statements, canceled checks, and wire transfer records that painted a picture of systematic theft disguised as family support. Exhibit A, Margaret announced, shows a $50,000 loan from William Harrison to Robert Harrison, dated February 15th of last year. The stated purpose was Ted's college expenses. She handed copies to everyone, then produced a second set of documents. Exhibit B shows where that money actually went. Crystal Harrison's business account specifically for inventory purchases for her jewelry boutique that closed 6 months later. Robert started to object, but Margaret cut him off. Exhibit C shows Robert Harrison forged his son's signature on financial aid forms claiming family support that was never provided. This constitutes both fraud and identity theft. The evidence kept coming like a flood that had burst through a dam. Linda's theft of $20,000, supposedly for my medical bills, which had actually funded her cosmetic surgery. Multiple instances where they'd used my name to secure credit or claim tax benefits while providing no actual support. But the most damaging evidence was William's meticulous documentation of every time he'd tried to reunite the family, only to be told by Robert and Linda that they preferred me to stay away. Your Honor, Margaret said, presenting a thick binder. This contains every birthday card William Harrison sent to his son and daughter-in-law, asking them to include his grandson in family gatherings. It also contains every response which consistently stated that my client was better off learning independence. She opened to a particularly damning page. This email from Linda Harrison, dated 6 months ago, specifically states, "We've moved on with our lives, and Ted should do the same. Stop trying to force a relationship that nobody wants." Judge Harrison studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades learning to spot lies. His expression grew darker with each piece of evidence, and I could see anger building behind his professional composure. "Mr. Morse," he said finally, "your client's documented communications directly contradict the evidence you've presented to this court. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Morse was sweating now, his expensive confidence evaporating like morning dew. "Your Honor, these recordings could have been manipulated or taken out of context. The defense has provided digital authentication for every recording," Margaret replied smoothly. "We also have witness testimony from 3 family friends who were present during several of these conversations." She called forward Mrs. Patterson, who'd been William's neighbor for 30 years, and Mr. Rodriguez, who'd worked construction with William for 2 decades. Both testified to hearing Robert and Linda express relief at being free from parental responsibilities, and their hope that I would just disappear and let them live their lives. But the final blow came when Margaret presented the legal documents that my parents had thought were buried in bureaucratic filing systems. "Your Honor," she said, holding up official paperwork with county seals and notary stamps. On April 15th of Ted Harrison's junior year of high school, Robert and Linda Harrison formally relinquished their parental rights to avoid legal liability for abandoning a minor child. The papers hit Judge Harrison's desk with a sound like a gavel striking judgment. These weren't emotional arguments or questionable recordings. These were legal documents signed and witnessed, proving that my parents had voluntarily severed all parental ties because they didn't want the responsibility of caring for their child. "They didn't just abandon my client emotionally," Margaret continued. "They abandoned him legally, officially, and permanently. They signed papers stating they never wanted him back. And now when there's money involved, they want this court to restore parental rights. They voluntarily surrendered." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Robert and Linda sat frozen, probably realizing for the first time that their casual cruelty had been documented and preserved. Crystal looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. And Morse looked like a man who'd just discovered his parachute had holes in it. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He opened his folder and pulled out one more document that would change everything. "Mr. Morse," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "before this court makes any decisions about inheritance rights, there's something else this court needs to address." The way he said it made it clear that the real battle was just beginning. Judge Harrison set down his pen and looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was sadness there, but also something that looked like determination, mixed with old grief. "Mr. Harrison," he said, using my formal name, "I need to make a disclosure that's relevant to these proceedings." The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing. "Your grandfather, William Harrison, was my friend," the judge continued. "We served together in Vietnam. We were best men at each other's weddings, and we stayed in touch for over 50 years. 3 months ago, when he was dying, he asked me to make him a promise." I felt my world tilt sideways. This wasn't just a random inheritance dispute being heard by a random judge. This was something much more personal and much more complicated. "Your Honor," Morse interrupted, standing quickly. "This creates a conflict of interest that requires your recusal from this case." "Sit down, Mr. Morse," Judge Harrison replied with enough authority to make a general snap to attention. "I'm not finished." He turned back to me, and I could see pain in his eyes. Your grandfather made me promise that if his family ever came after his will, I would make sure the truth came out. He gave me a sealed envelope 3 months ago with instructions to open it only if Robert and Linda Harrison contested his estate. Margaret and I exchanged glances. This was territory we hadn't mapped. Judge Harrison reached into his folder and pulled out an envelope that was yellowed with age and sealed with red wax. He broke the seal carefully, like he was opening something sacred. Before I read this, he said, "There's something else this court needs to know. Mr. Morse, your investigation into this family seems to have missed some crucial details about your client's recent activities." He nodded to the bailiff who opened a side door. In walked a man I didn't recognize wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a briefcase that had seen better years. He looked like a detective from an old movie complete with tired eyes and stubble that suggested he'd been working long hours. "This is Detective Raymond Ellis from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department," Judge Harrison announced. "Detective Ellis, would you please tell the court what your investigation has revealed about the plaintiffs, in this case?" Robert and Linda looked like deer caught in headlights. Crystal had gone completely pale, and Morse was shuffling through papers like he was looking for an escape plan. "Your Honor," Detective Ellis said in a voice that had probably delivered bad news to a lot of people, "our investigation into elder abuse allegations has uncovered evidence of systematic financial exploitation of William Harrison during the final years of his life." The words hit the courtroom like a bomb going off in slow motion. Mr. Robert Harrison used his father's credit cards without authorization on 17 separate occasions. Ellis continued consulting his notes. The total amount of unauthorized purchases was $43,000, including jewelry vacation expenses and home renovations. I watched my father's face crumble as the detective laid out his crimes in clinical detail. Ms. Linda Harrison accessed her former father-in-law's bank accounts using information she obtained during a visit to his home while he was hospitalized. She withdrew $28,000 in 6 separate transactions. But Ellis wasn't finished. Most significantly, we have security footage from First National Bank showing Mr. Robert Harrison forging his father's signature on withdrawal slips during William Harrison's final illness, when the victim was too weak to visit the bank himself. The detective handed a tablet to Judge Harrison, who watched the footage with an expression that could have melted steel. On the screen, my father was clearly visible signing my grandfather's name to document stealing money from a dying man who'd spent his life trying to take care of his family. The total amount of documented theft, Ellis concluded, exceeds $90,000. Warrants have been prepared for both defendants. Crystal suddenly stood up, her red dress bright against the wood paneling of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I need to make a statement." Morse grabbed her arm, but she shook him off. "I can't do this anymore." "Mrs. Harrison," Judge Harrison said formally, "you're not a party to these proceedings." "Actually, I am," she replied, her voice shaking. "Because I've been having an affair with Bradley Morse for 8 months, and he's been using information from our relationship to manipulate this case." The courtroom erupted. Morse jumped to his feet. Robert looked like he'd been shot, and Linda let out a sound that was part gasp and part bitter laughter. "Crystal, don't," Morse warned, but she was already committed to burning everything down. "Brad told me this would be easy money." She continued her words, tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "He said inheritance cases like this were slam dunks, especially when the heir was estranged. He promised me a percentage of whatever we won." She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through text messages. "I have texts where he admits to falsifying evidence. I have recordings of him coaching Robert and Linda on what to say. And I have bank records showing he's been paying court clerk Danny Sullivan for information about Judge Harrison's previous rulings." Judge Harrison's expression had moved beyond anger into something that looked like righteous fury. "Bailiff, please escort Mr. Sullivan from the building and contact the State Bar Association." "Your Honor." Crystal continued, tears streaming down her face. I pressured Robert into this lawsuit because my business failed and I needed money for my debts. I never loved him. I just saw an opportunity to marry someone with a rich father. Robert sat in stunned silence as his wife of 2 years systematically destroyed everything he thought he knew about his life. "She's lying," Morse said desperately. "Your Honor, this woman is obviously unstable and trying to avoid legal consequences for her own actions." But Crystal had one more bomb to drop. "Brad, you might want to check your phone. I've been recording our conversations for months, including the one where you admitted to bribing Danny Sullivan and falsifying evidence." She handed her phone to Detective Ellis, who accepted it like he'd just been given a Christmas present. Judge Harrison picked up William's letter and unfolded it carefully. As he read, his expression shifted from professional attention to something that looked like grief mixed with admiration. "Mr. Ted Harrison," he said finally, "your grandfather's final words to this court explain why he structured his will the way he did." He cleared his throat and began reading in a voice that carried the weight of a dying man's last wishes. "To Judge Harrison, my oldest friend. If you're reading this, it means my son and his wife have proven they are exactly the people I feared they'd become. Ted doesn't know this, but I've been testing Robert and Linda for years, giving them opportunities to do the right thing, every time they chose money over family. Every time they chose selfishness over love. This boy has more integrity in his little finger than they have in their entire bodies, and I want the world to know it." The letter continued, but Judge Harrison paused to look at me. "There's more, but the important part is this. Your grandfather didn't just leave you money, he left you vindication." He folded the letter and set it aside. "Mr. Morse, this court finds your evidence to be fraudulent, your methods to be unethical, and your clients to be guilty of elder abuse and inheritance fraud. This case is dismissed with prejudice." But even as victory washed over me, I realized this was just the beginning. Because William's will contained provisions that none of us had seen coming, clauses that would turn this legal victory into something much more meaningful. Judge Harrison wasn't finished reading my grandfather's letter. As the courtroom settled into stunned silence, he unfolded the second page with the careful attention of someone handling historical documents. "Your grandfather's final provisions," he announced, "contain instructions for exactly this scenario." He adjusted his glasses and continued reading. "If Robert and Linda contest this will and lose, they will face the following consequences. First, they will publicly apologize to Ted in open court, acknowledging their failures as parents and human beings. Second, they will each donate $50,000 to homeless youth charities, specifically those serving abandoned teenagers." Robert and Linda looked like they'd been hit by lightning. They didn't have $50,000 each, especially not after Detective Ellis's revelations about their theft and Crystal's confession about the failed business ventures. "But wait," Judge Harrison continued, "there's more." He smiled for the first time since the hearing began, and it was the kind of smile that suggested my grandfather had been planning this moment for years. "If Ted proves his character by handling this inheritance dispute with dignity and forgiveness rather than revenge, he will receive access to a secondary trust fund that I've established. This fund contains an additional $2 million specifically designated for the education of his future children." I felt my knees go weak. $7 million total. But more than that, my grandfather had somehow known that I'd choose forgiveness over vengeance, love over hate. Furthermore, the judge read, "If Ted chooses to use any portion of his inheritance to help others who've experienced family abandonment, the trust will match his donations dollar for dollar up to $1 million annually." The genius of William's plan was becoming clear. He hadn't just left me money, he'd created a system that would multiply generosity and turn this courtroom victory into something that could help thousands of kids who'd been thrown away like I had been. But Margaret Stone stood up with papers of her own, and I realized there were still more surprises coming. Your Honor, she said the defense would like to present evidence of additional criminal activity that's come to light during our investigation. She handed documents to Detective Ellis, who studied them with growing interest. What we've discovered, Margaret continued, is that Mr. Morse's law firm has been running a systematic scheme targeting inheritance disputes. They identify vulnerable families, falsify evidence, and split the proceeds with clients who are willing to perjure themselves. She presented bank records showing payments from Morse's firm to 12 different clients over the past 2 years, always in cases involving contested wills or estate disputes. Mr. Morse has been operating what amounts to an inheritance fraud ring, Margaret announced. The State Bar Association is already investigating, but criminal charges are pending in multiple counties. Morse tried to object, but Judge Harrison cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. Mr. Morse, the judge said you are hereby held in contempt of court. Your law license is suspended pending investigation, and you will remain in custody until bail is set. But the final twist came from an unexpected source. Danny Sullivan, the court clerk who'd been feeding information to Morse, had apparently been playing a longer game than anyone realized. Detective Ellis approached the bench with a thick folder. Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan has been cooperating with our investigation for 6 weeks. Every piece of information he gave to Mr. Morse was designed to make him overconfident about this case. The detective opened the folder to reveal months of documented conversations, recorded phone calls, and financial transactions that painted a complete picture of Morse's criminal enterprise. Sullivan came to us when he realized the scope of what Morse was doing, Ellis explained. He's been wearing a wire and documenting everything. The evidence we've gathered will put Morse away for years and help us identify dozens of victims who've been defrauded. I looked at my parents sitting in their expensive clothes that they'd probably bought with stolen money, facing criminal charges that would destroy their comfortable lives. I should have felt satisfaction or vindication, or at least some sense of justice. Instead, I felt sad. These people had given me life, but they'd never learned how to live it themselves. They'd chosen money over love, comfort over character, and selfishness over family. Now they were facing the consequences of those choices, and no amount of money would be able to fix what they'd broken. Linda was crying quietly, probably realizing for the first time what she'd lost when she chose vodka and self-pity over being a mother. Robert sat in stunned silence, watching his world collapse around him, like a house built on sand during a hurricane. Crystal had already distanced herself from both of them, gathering her purse and moving toward the exit like she was late for a more important appointment. She'd gotten what she came for, a way out of a bad marriage, and enough information to avoid criminal charges by cooperating with the prosecution. Mr. Ted Harrison. Judge Harrison said, bringing my attention back to the front of the courtroom, "This court finds that you are the rightful heir to your grandfather's estate, free and clear of any claims by the plaintiffs." He banged his gavel, making it official, then set aside his formal judicial role for a moment. "Your grandfather was proud of the man you became," he said quietly. "He used to call me every few months to tell me about your accomplishments, your character, your determination to succeed despite everything you'd been through. He said you had more integrity at 25 than most people develop in a lifetime." I stood up, feeling the weight of the moment settle around me like a heavy coat. "Thank you, Your Honor," I managed to say. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Thank the man who loved you enough to spend his final years making sure you'd be protected from people who would take advantage of your generous nature." As the courtroom began to empty, I realized this wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. I had resources now, but more importantly, I had a mission that my grandfather had designed specifically for my character. I was going to help kids who'd been abandoned, thrown away, and forgotten by the people who should have loved them most. And every dollar I spent doing it would be matched by the trust William had created, turning his love into a legacy that would outlive all of us. 6 months later, I stood in the same courtroom where my life had changed forever, but this time, I wasn't there as a defendant or plaintiff. I was there for the sentencing hearing of Bradley Morse, whose inheritance fraud scheme had unraveled like a cheap sweater in a washing machine. Judge Harrison presided over this hearing too, and when Morse was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Not for his crimes, but for the fact that he'd thrown away a successful career for money that would never have brought him happiness anyway. Robert received 3 years for elder abuse and financial fraud, with the possibility of parole in 18 months if he completed substance abuse counseling and made full restitution. Linda got 2 years suspended to probation and community service, partly because her cooperation had helped prosecutors identify other victims of Morse's scheme. Crystal had already moved to California using the immunity deal she'd negotiated to start fresh somewhere nobody knew her story. She'd sent me a card apologizing for her part in everything, but we both knew that some betrayals can't be healed with Hallmark sentiments. The money from the inheritance had allowed me to do something I'd dreamed about since those nights sleeping in the high school gym. I'd established the William Harrison Foundation for Youth Independence, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping abandoned and homeless teenagers build stable, successful lives. We'd opened 3 residential facilities in our first year, providing not just shelter, but education, job training, mental health counseling, and most importantly, the kind of unconditional support that every kid deserves, but too many never receive. Sarah, my girlfriend from college who'd stood by me through this entire ordeal, had become the foundation's director of operations. She'd always understood what it meant to be abandoned because her own parents had chosen drugs over family when she was 14. Together, we'd created something that neither of us had access to when we needed it most. The matching funds from Williams Trust meant that every dollar we invested in these kids became $2 of real change. In 6 months, we'd helped 43 young people get their GEDs, find steady employment, and most importantly, understand that their parents' failures didn't define their own potential. Margaret Stone had become our legal counsel working pro bono because she said watching justice prevail never got old. Judge Harrison had retired but served on our board of directors, bringing his decades of wisdom about human nature to guide our programs. But the most meaningful moment came 3 months after the trial when I received an unexpected visitor at the foundation's main office. Linda knocked on my door on a Tuesday afternoon looking older than her years but somehow more real than she'd appeared in that courtroom. She'd lost weight. Her hair was natural brown instead of highlighted blonde, and her clothes were simple rather than designer. "I know I have no right to be here," she said when I opened the door. "No, you don't," I agreed, "but come in anyway." We sat in my office surrounded by pictures of kids who'd found hope through the foundation, and she cried for 20 minutes straight. Not the manipulative tears of someone looking for sympathy, but the genuine grief of a woman who'd finally understood what she'd lost. "I was so angry," she said finally. "At your father, at myself, at life in general. And you were just this reminder of everything that hadn't worked out the way I'd planned." I was a kid, I pointed out. I needed parents, not people who saw me as a burden. I know that now. I've been in therapy trying to understand how I became someone who could abandon her own child. The answer isn't pretty. She told me about her childhood, about parents who'd measured love in terms of achievement and appearance, about a mother who told her she was worthless if she didn't look perfect, and a father who disappeared when she was 12, leaving her with abandonment issues that she'd never addressed. "That doesn't excuse what I did," she said quickly. "Nothing excuses it. But maybe it explains why I was so terrified of being responsible for another person's well-being when I couldn't even manage my own." We talked for 2 hours. I told her about those nights in the gym, about learning to survive on my own, about the fear and loneliness that had nearly broken me. She listened without making excuses or trying to minimize the damage she'd caused. "I want to make amends," she said finally. "Not because I think you'll forgive me or because I want a relationship, but because you deserved better, and I need to acknowledge that publicly. What did you have in mind? I want to volunteer here. Not in any role that involves decision-making or authority, just whatever needs doing. Cleaning, filing, answering phones." And I want to speak to some of these kids about the damage that parental abandonment causes so maybe they can understand it's not their fault. I studied her face looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. What I saw instead was genuine remorse, mixed with the kind of determination that comes from hitting bottom and deciding to climb back up. You can start next week, I said. But this isn't about rebuilding our relationship. This is about helping kids who've been where I was. I understand. She kept her word. Linda showed up every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 months, doing whatever work needed doing, and never asking for special treatment or recognition. She spoke to 3 different groups of teenagers about accountability, responsibility, and the long-term consequences of choosing selfishness over love. Those conversations were powerful for everyone involved. The kids got to hear from someone who'd made terrible choices and was living with the consequences. Linda got to understand in concrete terms how much damage abandonment causes and how many young people struggle with feelings of worthlessness because their parents couldn't handle the responsibility of unconditional love. I never forgave her in the sense of restored relationship or renewed trust. But I did forgive her in the sense of releasing my anger and resentment because carrying that poison was hurting me more than it was hurting her. Robert never reached out, never apologized, never showed any interest in making amends. He served his time, moved to another state, and disappeared from our lives completely. Some people aren't capable of growth or change, and accepting that reality was part of my own healing process. On the 1-year anniversary of my grandfather's death, I stood at his gravestone with Sarah Margaret Judge Harrison and 47 young people whose lives had been changed by the foundation he'd made possible. Your grandfather knew exactly who you were, Judge Harrison said, as we finished reading the names of everyone the foundation had helped. He knew you'd turn this inheritance into something bigger than money. He knew you'd choose love over revenge. I thought about that as we drove home through the city where I'd once been homeless and afraid. The foundation now operated in 5 states with plans to expand nationwide. We'd helped more than 200 young people find stability, education, and hope. The trust fund matching program meant we could continue this work indefinitely, turning William's love into a legacy that would help thousands of abandoned kids build better lives. That night, as Sarah and I planned our wedding and talked about the future, I realized something profound. My parents had given me the greatest gift possible, though they'd never intended it that way. By abandoning me, they'd forced me to develop resilience, empathy, and strength I never would have found in a comfortable traditional family. Their betrayal had taught me the value of loyalty. Their selfishness had taught me the importance of generosity. Their abandonment had taught me to cherish the people who choose to love you regardless of biological connections or legal obligations. I'd learned that family isn't about DNA or legal documents. It's about the people who show up when life gets difficult, who celebrate your successes without jealousy, and who love you not because they have to, but because they choose to. William had been my real father. Margaret had become like a protective aunt. Judge Harrison was the grandfather figure who'd seen me through the hardest battle of my life. Sarah was the partner who'd stood by me when I had nothing to offer but hope for a better future. And the kids at the foundation. They were the siblings I'd never had connected by shared experience and mutual understanding rather than blood or marriage. The money had been nice, but the real inheritance was much more valuable. William had left me the understanding that love multiplied when shared, that justice was worth fighting for, and that the best response to betrayal was not revenge, but redemption. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about a conversation I'd had with one of our newest foundation residents, a 15-year-old named Marcus, whose parents had kicked him out for being gay. "How do you not hate them?" he'd asked me. "Because hating them would make me like them," I'd answered. And I've worked too hard becoming myself to waste time being them. That was William's final lesson. The best revenge against people who try to diminish you is becoming more than they ever thought possible, and using that success to help others rise above their own circumstances. The courtroom battle had ended with justice. But the real victory was just beginning, measured not in dollars won, but in lives transformed, not in enemies defeated, but in hope restored. The last thing I did before falling asleep was add a note to my phone about expanding the foundation to include family counseling services, because maybe some parents could learn to be better before they threw their children away. Maybe some families could be saved before they broke apart. After all, if my grandfather had taught me anything, it was that love was worth fighting for, forgiveness was stronger than revenge. And sometimes, the best way to heal from betrayal was to make sure it never happened to anyone else. So let me ask you this: when someone hurts you deeply, do you choose revenge? Or do you choose to build something better? Have you ever had to forgive someone who didn't deserve it, not for their sake, but for your own peace? And what would you do if you discovered that your greatest pain had actually been preparing you for your greatest purpose? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming betrayal and finding hope in unexpected places. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their past doesn't define their future. And remember, sometimes the family that abandons you is just making room for the family that will choose you. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that no matter what you've been through, your worth isn't determined by the people who couldn't see it. Keep fighting for your dreams. Keep believing in your value, and keep building the life you deserve. Until next time, choose love over revenge, hope over bitterness, and always remember that your story isn't over yet.